So, from our second half of the class, I decided, out of everything we learned, since we talked about feminism, feminist ethics, I decided to do struggles of women today, more in particularly the struggles of women in other countries and domestic abuse. So, starting off with 10 worst countries for gender inequality, we have Afghanistan coming in first, Syria, then South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Chad, Sudan, Sierra Leone, I hope I'm saying that right, Somalia, Central African Republic, and Pakistan. So these were the 10 worst countries for women in particularly. And most of these countries kind of have the same issues regarding like schooling, gender-based violence, how many women are actually like employed, and overall like how many women are in like organized political groups and feeling safe in their communities. One critique that we learned was in feminist ethics was that it excluded women of color, LGBTQ community, disabled women, and it mostly focused on white women. And brown and black women definitely have a much different struggle than white women. So I thought it was pretty interesting that these top 10 countries were particularly like Middle East, and the African areas. I feel like we see a lot of emphasis on like the wage gap in America, and like abortion rights, but these are kind of rights these women would never even imagine having. So I thought it was pretty interesting that these top 10 countries were predominantly Middle Eastern, African countries, even though I wasn't that surprised. So, again, some of the problems these women face are gender based violence. Actually, in one of the articles that we had to read, Mapping the Margins, Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color, for a lot of these, although this isn't in the US, but it did talk about how many women that are immigrants face this problem where it's kind of like a hush hush culture around the idea of domestic abuse, and they're actually like scared to speak out, don't have a lot of like knowledge on it. In these countries, it is obviously much worse. There's not really a culture around that either of speaking out about gender-based violence, and even if there is, it's kind of more of like a male-dominated culture society where speaking out isn't going to do as much as it would, as I guess it would in America, even though there are their own cons and things wrong in our system as well, but even worse for them. Female genital mutilation is huge, especially like in Syria, where they basically like sew a woman's vagina closed. Early marriage, forced marriages, low employment rates, obviously, because most of these times these women take on more of like a housewife kind of position, stay in the house, don't really work, and limits on education as well. So, primarily focusing on domestic abuse, some myths I wanted to talk about. That one, domestic abuse is a private matter. And the fact is that keeping it a secret helps no one, and it's actually shown to harm children. It incurs substantial costs to the society and serves to perpetrate abuse through learned patterns of behavior. And a lot of these women in these other countries where the culture around it is much different do have this hush hush culture we talked about that was in that article about intersectionality on women of color and violence against them. A lot of times it's just engraved into the culture almost, which is really sad, but this also happens in America on a daily. Another myth is, if it's so bad, why does the victim not leave? It must not be that bad. I think this kind of goes into our lecture where we said that the moral experience of women is worthy of respect and subordination of women is morally wrong. So again, a lot of the times victims aren't really believed or people don't think it's that bad. So What a fact actually is that fear, lack of safe options, and the ability to survive, usually economically, prevents many victims from leaving abusive relationships. A lot of the times the woman is left really financially unstable because they're dependent on the man that they're with and or the woman. But the most dangerous times for a victim is when he/she attempts to leave the relationship, or when the abuser discovers that he/she has made a plan to leave. Another thing I want to talk about is that people love to say that, oh, domestic abuse happens in both genders, which is true, but it does primarily affect women more. Another myth is that victims provoke their partner's violence, and the use of violence is never justifiable or acceptable. There's no excuse for domestic violence, no matter the argument or the situation. The abuser usually picks who they want to abuse, and it's calculated. So, like I was talking about before on why women don't leave, we also talked about, or we read in that same article of intersectionality and violence against like women, that most of the time the women are financially dependent on these men. So, homelessness and domestic abuse kind of go hand in hand. 32% of homeless women said that domestic violence contributed to their homelessness, which you see that statistic in the far right corner. And over half, 52% of domestic abuse victims need to support to help stay in their own home or even move to a new accommodation. And a lot of the time, these women are taking children with them or have not been in the workforce, and they have all of this to figure out while also leaving a super unsafe situation. So it really does like hurt them the most once they are leaving, which is very, very sad. And so that is some like statistics about women in America. As compared to these women in other countries, even, there is no support really for when these women do leave their husbands. Most of the time, even in society, there's not a lot of opportunities for them to like get a job. Society kind of looks down on these single women with children. I actually watched a documentary on Netflix, and it was about a Pakistani girl whose dad and uncle had tried to kill her, and she ended up surviving the gunshot wound, and she ended up trying to like fight it in court, and society was kind of telling her to forgive her father, forgive her uncle. And so there's this like law there that if there is some family matter like that, if you forgive them in court, that they're kind of let go. And these women have this huge pressure because if they don't forgive said man, usually their family's the one that suffers. Her mother would be one that suffers. Her siblings would be one to suffer because there's no one bringing in any money to the household. So it kind of puts these women in really, really tricky positions. So it's interesting to look at how things affect us in this country, but even worse, how they affect women of color in these other countries where they don't have as much resources as thankfully we do.